Jon Stewart thought it would be just another interview. But Caroline Levitt had other plans, and it changed everything. It's not just an interview, it's a moment that can change the way millions look at the world. Post in the comments where are you watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the latest stories. The studio lights gleamed brightly, casting a warm glow over the sleek set of The Problem with Jon Stewart. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their murmurs blending into a low hum of excitement. Tonight's guest was Caroline Levitt, a rising political figure whose unapologetic style and bold rhetoric had made her both a darling of her supporters and a lightning rod for controversy. Her invitation to the show had been the subject of much speculation, with many wondering how she would fare against Stewart's sharp wit and seasoned sarcasm. Caroline entered the studio with a confident stride, her tailored blazer and poised demeanor exuding professionalism. She greeted the audience with a polite nod, her smile unwavering despite the palpable tension in the room. Stewart, seated comfortably behind his desk, rose to greet her with his trademark grin, a mix of charm and mischief that hinted at the verbal sparring to come. "Caroline Levitt," he began, his voice smooth and inviting. "Thank you for joining us tonight. I have to say, it's not every day we get someone as spirited as you on the show." His words were laced with subtle irony, a playful jab that elicited a chuckle from the audience. Caroline returned his smile, her eyes steady. "Thank you for having me, Jon. I'm looking forward to a thoughtful conversation." Stewart leaned back in his chair, his grin widening. "Thoughtful conversation? Oh, Caroline, you're on my show. We don't do thoughtful, we do entertaining. But don't worry, I'll try to keep it civil. Mostly." The audience laughed, and Caroline's smile remained intact. She knew the game Stewart was playing, and she was ready. The interview began with Stewart's usual charm, his questions seemingly innocuous but tinged with sarcasm. "So, Caroline, you're one of the youngest political figures out there. Tell me, what's it like being, well, let's just say, politically precocious?" Caroline tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "It's challenging, Jon, but it's also an opportunity. Being young means I bring a fresh perspective, and I'm not afraid to challenge the status quo." Stewart raised an eyebrow, his grin turning sly. "Ah, the status quo. That's a favorite phrase of politicians, isn't it? But let's be honest, Caroline. How much of the status quo can you really challenge when you're still figuring out where the coffee machine is in the Capitol?" The audience erupted in laughter, and Stewart leaned forward, clearly enjoying the moment. Caroline, however, remained composed. She knew this was only the beginning. "Well, Jon," she replied, her tone measured, "I think challenging the status quo isn't about knowing where the coffee machine is. It's about knowing where the real problems are and having the courage to address them." Stewart nodded, his grin unwavering. "Fair point, but let's talk about those problems. You've been pretty vocal about your views, and let's just say not everyone agrees with you. How do you handle the criticism? Or do you just block everyone on Twitter?" The audience laughed again, and Stewart's eyes sparkled with amusement. Caroline, however, didn't flinch. "Criticism is part of the job," she said firmly. "I welcome it because it means people are paying attention. And as for Twitter, Jon, I don't block people, I engage with them. That's how you build understanding." Stewart leaned back, his grin turning into a smirk. "Engage, huh? Well, Caroline, I hope you're ready to engage tonight, because I've got a few questions that might make you uncomfortable." The audience murmured in anticipation, sensing the shift in tone. Stewart's charm was still present, but his words carried a sharper edge now. Caroline, however, remained steady, her confidence unshaken. "Jon," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't ready." The stage was set, the tension palpable. The audience leaned forward, eager to see how the conversation would unfold. Stewart's wit was sharp, but Caroline's resolve was unwavering. The battle of words had begun, and neither side was backing down. The atmosphere in the studio shifted noticeably as the interview progressed. What began as a courteous exchange now advanced into a more charged, confrontational dialogue. Jon Stewart's earlier playful tone had taken on a sharper edge. His smile, which had initially exuded warmth and wit, slowly faded into a look of calculated mischief. The audience, now on the edge of their seats, sensed that the conversation was about to veer into dangerous territory, a verbal battleground where personal histories and public personas would collide. Stewart leaned forward over his desk, tapping his fingers lightly as if to drum up suspense. "Caroline," he began, voice laced with biting irony. "You speak so eloquently about challenging the status quo and bringing fresh ideas to politics. But let's be honest, how much of this is really about being politically progressive, and how much of it is just youthful bravado? You've criticized the establishment for being too rigid, yet here you are participating in the very game you claim to despise." Caroline maintained her steady gaze, her posture calm but resolute. "I believe that leadership isn't about playing by outdated rules. It's about reimagining our approach to solving our nation's problems," she replied evenly. "Yes, I'm young, but that means I bring the perspective of a generation that refuses to accept injustice as inevitable." Stewart's smirk reappeared for a brief moment. "A generation that refuses injustice. How noble! But let's get something straight," he said, his tone growing more incisive. "Your critics say that your positions are untested, that you lack the real-world experience necessary to navigate the murky waters of our political system. Perhaps you could share with us, what exactly have you done, aside from tossing buzzwords, to prove that you can fix these problems? Surely, the political arena is not a playground for idealistic dreams." The audience murmured, the tension in the studio palpable. Caroline took a measured breath before responding, her eyes never wavering from Stewart's. "Experience isn't solely measured in years spent in office or in the traditional corridors of power," she said. "It's also about having witnessed injustice firsthand and dedicating yourself to remedying it. I grew up in communities that faced systemic neglect, where voices like mine were too often dismissed. My journey into politics wasn't a leap into the unknown. It was a necessary step driven by personal accountability and a commitment to those who have been left behind." Stewart's expression shifted ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing as he prepared his next salvo. "You mention injustice and personal accountability," he drawled. "But isn't it ironic that someone who talks so much about reform hasn't yet weathered the trials of real political life? Tell me, Caroline, when faced with the inevitable compromises that come with power, will you be strong enough to hold onto these lofty ideals?" A brief pause ensued. The studio lights seemed to intensify as if spotlighting the gravity of his challenge. Caroline's response was calm but resonant, a prelude to an answer that would soon shake the very foundation of the conversation. "Jon, I believe that the true test of leadership is precisely how one responds when confronted with the bitter realities of decision-making. And while experience is important, it should never be an excuse for inaction or a shield behind which the established order hides. I've always believed that if you stand for something, you must also be prepared to sacrifice for it. Political experience is earned through resilience in the face of adversity, not merely by the number of years one has been in office." Stewart leaned back, momentarily taken aback by the gravity of her statement. His eyes glinted with the thrill of the challenge, and he quickly sought to steer the conversation back to safer ground, or so he hoped. "Let's pivot, then," he said with a controlled chuckle that failed to hide his lingering skepticism. "You've been very vocal about modernizing the system. Some might even call you, dare I say it, politically inexperienced. What do you say to those who doubt your readiness for the tough decisions that await you?" At this moment, the tension in the studio reached a boiling point. The audience fell silent. Every eye was fixed on Caroline as she prepared to address a challenge that had the potential to become the turning point of the evening. For a split second, it was as if time stood still. Then, with a quiet determination that belied the intensity of the moment, Caroline's tone shifted subtly. Her voice took on a timbre that was both impassioned and intimate. "Jon," she began softly, her words measured, "I'd like to share a story that perhaps not even you or your viewers have heard before." The studio, once filled with indulgent laughter and casual banter, leaned in as if compelled by gravity. Growing up, I watched my family struggle against a system that was designed to ignore us. I remember nights when we'd sit at the kitchen table, counting every dollar, wondering how we could make ends meet when those in power turned a blind eye to us. One particularly harsh winter, my father lost a job that supported our small home because a decision was made that favored someone else, someone with just a bit more privilege or the right connections. I remember the tears, the quiet despair, and the burning need to fight back against a system that, in its arrogance, thought it could trample over the dreams of people like us. There was a pause as Caroline let her words sink in. The audience was visibly moved, the lights now reflecting in many eyes with unshed emotion. "That is the truth of why I stepped into politics," she continued, her voice growing steadier with every word. "I wasn't born into power, Jon. I was born into struggle. And every step I take in this arena is a step to reclaim dignity for those who have been silenced for too long. I have seen the fallout of decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions that cost lives, broke families, and left entire communities voiceless. I stand here as a testament to those who fought back, who refused to be defined by the limits imposed on them. Political inexperience? Perhaps by the standards of the elite. But experience, true experience, is the grit you feel in your bones when you know what it's like to be marginalized." For a long, heavy moment, the air seemed to vibrate with the power of her confession. Stewart's eyes widened, his trademark smirk faltering as he absorbed the profound vulnerability behind her measured words. The studio audience, initially expecting another of his sarcastic jabs, was now witnessing a raw revelation, a glimpse into the personal scars that had shaped Caroline's resolve. In that moment, the balance of power subtly shifted. The conversation, once set on a one-sided path of mockery, was tilting toward a deeper truth that exuded authenticity and undeniable strength. Stewart, ever the consummate host with years at the helm of sharp televised debates, faltered. The cheeky challenge he had prepared, one aimed at highlighting her political inexperience, now hung in the air, unanswered, as Caroline's story resonated far beyond the confines of the studio. The questions in the room had transformed from casual jabs into earnest inquiries about justice, dignity, and the cost of reclaiming one's voice against a system rigged to favor the powerful. As the tension escalated, the audience began to murmur among themselves, some in awe, others in contemplative silence. In that charged environment, Caroline's willingness to expose a piece of her painful past not only disarmed Stewart's barbed approach but also previewed the seismic shift that was about to follow in the broader media discourse. The balance of the interview had tilted, and while Stewart tried to maintain his charismatic poise, it was evident that Caroline had firmly seized control of the narrative. Her words not only struck a chord with the live audience but also set in motion reactions that would ripple out across the country. Social media lights were already beginning to flicker with anticipation of the full interview, and the seeds of a broader societal discussion on the role of privilege, empathy, and resilience in leadership were being sown. The studio lights softened as Caroline leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a hidden fire. For a moment, the playful banter and razor-sharp sarcasm that had colored the early part of the interview fell away. The air seemed to hold its breath. Jon Stewart's confident smile faltered, and even the audience's anticipatory chuckles stilled into an expectant silence. It was as if everyone sensed that they were about to witness more than a verbal sparring match. This was about to become a revelation of truth. "Jon," Caroline began, her voice calm but resonant with an intensity that carried years of quiet suffering and hard-fought lessons. "I'm not just a politician who recites policy bullet points or tosses around clever one-liners. I'm a product of circumstances that shaped me in ways you might find uncomfortable." There was a moment, a pregnant pause, before she continued. "I want to tell you about the turning point in my life, one that propelled me into the very arena I stand in today." The cameras zoomed in slightly, capturing every nuance of Caroline's expression, an amalgam of vulnerability and steely determination. "I grew up in a small town much like this one, where the color of your skin often dictated the opportunities available to you. My mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and nurture a home filled with hope, while my father battled systems that seemed engineered to keep him down. I remember nights when we'd sit together at our small kitchen table, the dim glow of a flickering lamp painting long shadows on the walls, and I would listen intently as they spoke of dreams deferred and sacrifices made. Her voice rose and fell, each word carefully measured, yet laden with emotional heft. "One winter," Caroline recalled, her tone softening to a near whisper that nonetheless carried clearly through the studio. "I was only 13. The cold was unrelenting, and our home, small as it was, struggled to keep the bitter air at bay. That season, my father lost his job. A job he'd held for nearly a decade. A job that was not just his livelihood but a symbol of our dignity. The decision, made behind closed doors by those with the power to help yet choosing to look away, left our family reeling. I remember the headlines in the local paper. Economic adjustments hit hard. But for us, there was no adjustment. There was only despair and a burning desire for something better." Caroline paused, her eyes momentarily drifting as if recalling the acrid taste of injustice. "I vividly recall the look on my mother's face that evening, a mix of profound sorrow and an unyielding determination. In that moment, I realized that if we were to survive this system, if we were truly to claim our dignity, I would have to fight back. And so, I began to question everything. Why must we accept conditions that strip us of our humanity? Why must voices like ours be silenced by a system that favors power over people?" Her words, delivered with a sincerity that was both raw and refined, created a palpable shift in the room. Jon Stewart, ever the consummate host, found himself momentarily silent, a rare lapse in his typically witty repartee. The audience listened, rapt and visibly moved. For many, Caroline's personal account was more than a political statement. It was a living embodiment of the struggles that had been hidden beneath layers of societal indifference. "I remember feeling small, as if the very air I breathed were tainted with injustice," she continued, her voice steadying with each word. "That moment in my youth ignited a fire within me. It taught me that political inexperience, as some like to label it, is not a flaw, it's a strength. Because I've seen what happens when the powerful ignore those without a voice. I've seen communities crumble under the weight of neglect and apathy. My journey, our journey, into politics is not about pride or personal ambition. It's about representing every person who's ever been marginalized, every dream that has been deferred." At that, the studio's atmosphere transformed completely. A heavy silence gave way to a collective, almost tangible, sense of empathy and recognition. The audience wasn't merely watching a political debate. They were witnessing the unveiling of a soul defined by resilience. Caroline's revelation had turned the tide. Her narrative pierced through the cynicism and bravado, revealing instead the truth of lived experience. Each listener, whether a viewer at home or someone present in the studio, could feel a stirring of renewed purpose. Jon Stewart's eyes, usually sharp with sarcasm, now betrayed a flicker of genuine respect, and perhaps even a hint of regret for having underestimated the depth behind Caroline's poised demeanor. For a heartbeat, his usual retorts fell silent as he absorbed the gravity of her story. In that charged moment, the interview pivoted decisively. Caroline had not only countered Stewart's attempts to demean her with irony, she had redefined the narrative entirely by sharing a story of personal injustice and transformative resolve. The conversation was no longer about political expedience or clever quips. It had become a movement, a clarion call for a re-examination of the very values that shaped public discourse. The studio air grew even heavier as Caroline's eyes locked with Jon Stewart's, her steady gaze now tinged with an intensity that silenced even the most jaded viewers. The previous narrative of personal struggle had wound its way into every ear in the studio. Now the moment demanded a revelation that would leave no one unchanged. "Jon," Caroline began, her voice lowering just a fraction so that every word carried an almost palpable weight. "There's a part of my story I haven't yet shared, a truth that goes deeper than mere hardship or economic struggle. You see, growing up, I not only witnessed injustice, I was directly targeted by it." A hush fell over the audience as the camera slowly zoomed in to capture each subtle emotion flickering across her face. She paused, allowing the tension to swell, her eyes flickering between determination and pain. "For years, she continued, voice thick with remembered sorrow. I believed that the challenges my family endured were unfortunate byproducts of a cruel economic system, but the reality was far more sinister. When I was 16, an event occurred that forever reshaped my perspective on political power and corruption. It wasn't simply about my father losing his job or our neighborhood suffering from neglect. It was about a calculated effort by a small group of influential figures to silence voices like ours. Her tone sharpened as she spoke, each syllable deliberate and resonant. I have uncovered evidence, documents, correspondence, even recordings, that reveal a covert alliance between high-ranking officials and corporate interests. They colluded to not only push my father out of his position, but to ensure that anyone willing to speak out about their malfeasance would be systematically marginalized. It was a conspiracy designed to protect their wealth and maintain control. Stewart's trademark smirk wavered as he registered the unexpected ferocity behind her words. The audience, previously treated to his clever retorts, watched in rapt silence. Caroline drew a deep breath, as if preparing herself to dismantle the very foundation of the narrative Jon had so carefully constructed. What I'm saying is this. The disregard for dignity you often mock isn't born out of incompetence or youthful inexperience. It's the result of an orchestrated campaign to suppress dissent, to keep powerful interests unchallenged. My father, a good and honest man, became the first casualty when he tried to hold those in power accountable. And I, like so many others in my community, had to learn that the path to change is paved not just with idealism, but with the willingness to confront a well-oiled machine of privilege. Her voice, both defiant and tender, carried the weight of a lifetime of secrets made public. I hold in my possession sealed files obtained from whistleblowers within the system, a dossier that details how decisions were made behind closed doors to ensure that voices like mine would never have the platform to call out injustice. I've seen memos outlining strategies to discredit community leaders, emails that order the suppression of protests, and reports that were deliberately misrepresented in the media to maintain a facade of impartiality. This isn't the isolated incident of my family's misfortune. It's a systematic exploitation designed to keep them marginalized in their place. A murmur spread through the studio as viewers at home and in the audience grappled with the enormity of her claims. The camera cut briefly to shots of stunned faces among the crew and audience members. Those who had come expecting a polite political debate were now witnessing a searing indictment of an entrenched establishment. Caroline's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her tone remained unyielding. I stand here today not simply as a candidate or as a voice of youthful idealism, but as a survivor of that system, and as a fighter determined to tear it down. I refuse to let my personal history be an anomaly, and I refuse to allow any more families to be crushed under the weight of hidden power plays. For several long, weighted moments, Jon Stewart searched her face for any signs of exaggeration. His practiced skepticism met an unyielding truth, an authenticity that he plainly hadn't anticipated. The silence in the studio was nearly absolute, broken only by the low hum of the audience's collective intake of breath. Finally, Stewart's voice emerged, softer now, edged with a respectful curiosity. Caroline, if what you're saying is true, then you're not just challenging outdated policies. You're exposing a level of corruption that even seasoned journalists wouldn't dare to touch. I must admit, I wasn't prepared for that. His admission, though brief, sent ripples of astonishment through the studio. The air was charged with the sound of shifting perspectives. Caroline pressed on, her next words measured and deliberate. I'm not here to sensationalize my past, Jon, but to show that the fight for justice is personal. That every time we allow those in power to hide their misdeeds behind bureaucracy and silence the voices of those they've wronged, we all lose a little more of our shared humanity. Her gaze, unflinching and resolute, swept over the audience. I want you and everyone watching tonight to understand that this isn't just about political inexperience or idealistic dreams. This is about reclaiming our right to be heard. It's about unmasking a system that thrives on fear and secrecy. The truth I've revealed today is only the beginning, a spark that I hope will ignite deeper scrutiny and, ultimately, meaningful reform. In that instant, the balance of the interview had irrevocably shifted. Jon Stewart, the consummate interviewer famed for his acerbic wit, had been forced into a rare moment of introspection. The studio lights, reflecting off teary eyes and attentive faces, confirmed that Caroline's revelation was not merely a personal vendetta turned public. It was a call for systemic change that resonated with the collective conscience. As the cameras captured every nuanced expression, an undercurrent of determination surged through the audience. Caroline had not only countered Stewart's doubts, she had upended the entire conversation and, in doing so, challenged every viewer to reconsider the integrity of the institutions they once trusted. Almost as soon as Caroline finished speaking, the silence that filled the studio was shattered by a collective exhalation, a mix of astonishment, admiration, and even discomfort. The charged air pulsated with raw emotion, and for a few heartbeats, it seemed as if time itself had paused to let her truth echo through every corner of the room. In the studio, the shift was palpable. The once confident, sardonic sparkle in Jon Stewart's eyes was replaced by a contemplative seriousness. The witty banter that usually defined his segments took a back seat as he struggled to find his usual retort. His microphones, which had carried his razor-sharp humor moments earlier, now seemed to be listening intently to a voice that transformed the conversation from a clever sparring match into a searing public reckoning. There was visible shock among the live studio audience. Some viewers leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, mouths slightly agape, as if the impassioned confession had penetrated not only the polished veneer of the set, but also their personal convictions about power, corruption, and the true cost of injustice. A ripple of murmurs and quiet applause began to build, a spontaneous outpouring of support that swept through the room like a rising tide of collective emotion. Backstage, crew members exchanged glances that held a blend of disbelief and respect. Even individuals known for their habitual cynicism could not help but be moved by Caroline's unwavering honesty. The gravity of her words had ignited something in everyone present, from the camera operators and producers to the guests who had come to watch a performance, not expecting such a seismic pivot in tone. For many, this was not just television. It was a moment when the veil of polished rhetoric was torn away, revealing the raw intensity of real lived experience. Simultaneously, beyond the studio walls, an entirely new conversation was erupting on the internet. Within minutes of the interview clip being uploaded online, social media platforms were flooded with reactions that ranged from heartfelt support to fervent discussion on the systemic issues Caroline had so brutally exposed. Comments poured in, messages of gratitude for shedding light on the unspoken truths of political power, declarations of solidarity from individuals who saw their own struggles reflected in her testimony, and even, from unexpected quarters, voices of resignation as well as admiration. News outlets scrambled to replay the segment. Talk shows and online forums exploded with debates about the accountability of those in power and the responsibilities of the media to challenge preconceived narratives rather than reinforce them. Across digital communities, Caroline's revelation was dissected by pundits, scholars, and everyday citizens alike. Videos of the segment were shared and reshared, with clippings emphasizing the sincerity and the conviction in her tone. Analysts compared her emotional cadence to moments of revolutions past, when a single voice broke the silence and inspired a collective transformation. Comments noted that her revelation about how covert alliances and hidden policies had tainted decisions made in boardrooms and behind closed doors was not only unexpected but paradigm-shifting. Viewers found themselves questioning the narrative they had known, their skepticism now intertwined with a cautious hope for change. Within hours, the segment had become a focal point of national discourse. Overnight, the clip was being replayed in segments during primetime news broadcasts, sparking roundtables that delved deeply into how institutions, including the media, often underplayed the voices of those who come from underrepresented communities. Political commentators, who had at first dismissed Caroline's candid sharing as overly dramatic, were now forced to weigh in on the profound implications of her words. They discussed, sometimes heatedly, how her personal narrative was emblematic of a much broader failure, a failure of a system that had long relied on polished retorts and rehearsed responses, rather than genuine, hard-hitting truths. Even among Jon Stewart's loyal viewers, there was an evident and uncharacteristic shift of perspective. Social media feeds that earlier celebrated his sharp wit were now peppered with comments expressing admiration that he had allowed the interview to take its course, however reluctantly. Some tweets and blog posts noted, without using hashtags or superficial slogans, that Stewart's own momentary faltering was a mirror of the larger awakening. When the established order is called to account, even its fiercest defenders may be forced to listen. Inside the studio, the energy had transformed from a contentious debate into something on the verge of catharsis. Stewart's next words emerged slowly, as if he were choosing them with the utmost care. "Caroline," he finally said, his tone softer and more reflective, "I must commend you for your candor. I came here expecting a show filled with witty repartee and clever jabs. Instead, tonight, you've reminded us all that there are truths far more compelling than any punchline." His acknowledgement, though brief, resonated deeply in the charged silence that followed. The collective reaction wasn't confined to the intellectual or political realms. It was visceral, touching hearts and reshaping opinions. Viewers began to recount their own experiences of feeling marginalized, of witnessing power used to silence rather than to serve. In countless living rooms and coffee shops across the nation, debates erupted not about who was funnier or more charming, but about who had the more authentic voice, the one that spoke of real lives and real struggles. By the time the credits of the program rolled, the impact of Caroline's disclosure had rippled far beyond the confines of the studio. Journalists began calling for follow-up interviews and investigative pieces that might substantiate her claims. Social networks, long criticized for superficial dialogues, were now abuzz with calls for accountability and earnest discussions about how political experience is measured, not solely in years served, but in the scars and stories that compel genuine action. The ripple had ignited a wave of reevaluation of how media dialogues were conducted. A call for substance over style, for truth over rehearsed humor. Caroline's segment, enriched by her emotional clarity and raw vulnerability, had unquestionably altered the trajectory of the conversation. It was becoming evident that when a singular, well-founded voice breaks through the din of cynical banter, it can initiate a cascade of reflection that no clever remark can ever hope to match. The interview was no longer solely about media sparring. It had become a transformative moment, one that would force viewers, critics, and even established institutions to rethink the very nature of how truth is conveyed and consumed. The atmosphere in the studio had already been irrevocably transformed. As Caroline's impassioned revelation hung in the air, Jon Stewart found himself grappling with a rare, uncharacteristic moment of introspection. The once sardonic host, known for his relentless acerbic humor, appeared visibly affected. His eyes, which had danced with mischief mere minutes before, now shimmered with an unspoken respect, and perhaps even regret. After a weighted pause that stretched as if measured in heartbeats, Stewart cleared his throat. His voice, stripped of its typical playful lilt, resonated with an unfamiliar sincerity. "Caroline," he began slowly, "your story, your truth. It's something I didn't see coming tonight. I came here expecting a battle of wits, a chance to poke fun at political naivety. But what I've witnessed has been so much more than that." His gaze softened, and the tight line of his mouth faltered into a thoughtful frown. "I realize now that there are truths in our society that we often try to dismiss with laughter, that we hide behind humor instead of confronting with earnestness." The studio fell into a reflective hush. For the first time in what felt like ages, Stewart's retort was not a clever quip but an invitation, an acknowledgement that he, too, had been challenged by a voice that cut through the cacophony of political rhetoric. "Your courage," he continued, "to expose something so personal and yet so deeply systemic is nothing short of admirable. It takes an immense strength to stand by your convictions in the face of harsh scrutiny, and to reveal truths that many find too painful to hear." A ripple of applause surged around the studio as audiences, having witnessed Caroline's soul-bearing testimony, rose in support. The energy was electric, a mixture of admiration, validation, and a thirst for change that transcended partisan divides. Even Stewart, the harbinger of biting satire, seemed to absorb the overwhelming sincerity reflected back by the collective sentiment. In that charged moment of candor, Stewart's demeanor shifted further. "I must confess," he added, his tone now somber yet earnest. "I may have underestimated what it means to carry the weight of experience that isn't born in the gilded halls of power, but rather in the everyday struggles of real people. Your narrative forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that while policy debates can be dry and calculated, real life is messy and raw, and often, that is where the true wisdom lies." Even as he spoke, the cameras captured the transformation in the studio. Faces in the audience, previously amusement-masked or indifferent, now shone with reflective empathy. Social media platforms, which only moments ago had been dominated by rapid-fire banter and biting jokes, now overflowed with streams of messages praising Caroline's candor. Tweets, blog posts, and shared videos amassed millions of views almost instantaneously, reconfiguring the narrative from one of a contentious interview to a watershed moment in political discourse. Backstage, producers and correspondents whispered among themselves, acknowledging that this segment might well redefine the tenor of political interviews nationwide. The viral video clip of Caroline's revelation was now pinned by major news outlets. Analysis pieces began emerging on how such moments compel even the most established voices to reconsider their stance on what it means to be politically experienced. It was clear. Caroline had changed the conversation, and Stewart's concession was a public testament to that transformation. At the very edge of the stage, Caroline paused amid the applause, the intensity of the moment evident in the subtle tremor of her hands and a determined set in her jaw. With her posture as poised as ever, she allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile, a gesture that conveyed not triumph over an adversary, but a shared victory over a system that too often silenced the marginalized. Stewart then summed up the evening with a final note that resonated far beyond the studio walls. "Tonight," he said, looking directly into the camera with a renewed sense of purpose, "we've seen that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sharp wit or a cutting remark, but the unwavering commitment to truth. Caroline, thank you for reminding us all that when you speak from the heart, you invite even the most skeptical of us to listen and learn." The applause swelled into a standing ovation that lasted long enough for the resounding echoes to be felt in every corner of the studio, and shortly thereafter, across every digital platform. Moderators in newsrooms began replaying the moment, and talk show hosts across the nation acknowledged that the day's conversation had shifted paradigms. In living rooms from coast to coast, families and communities engaged in impassioned discussions about the power of vulnerability, the necessity of accountability, and the role of media in challenging entrenched power structures. In that defining hour, Caroline had done more than just survive a hostile interview. She had become a catalyst for change. And while Stewart's own role as provocateur was well established, his recognition of her strength had signaled a subtle but significant shift in the cultural landscape. Viewers were left with an indelible impression that intellect and integrity, when combined, are forces strong enough to challenge even the most entrenched systems of privilege. As the segment concluded, the studio lights dimmed gradually, leaving behind a hush filled with hope, reflection, and the promise that the conversation about truth and justice had only just begun. In that transformative space, the seeds of a reimagined media dialogue, and perhaps even a reformed society, were now firmly planted, thanks to one remarkable evening of candor and courage. The morning after the broadcast, America awoke to an entirely redefined narrative. What had begun as a contentious media interview in a polished studio had metamorphosed into an undeniable watershed moment in public discourse. Across news channels, social media platforms, and countless living rooms, the conversation was no longer centered on snappy retorts or sarcastic jibes. Instead, it had shifted focus to a profound reckoning about truth, accountability, and the role of media in shaping our society. Within hours of the show's conclusion, clips of Caroline Levitt's heartfelt revelations spread like wildfire, streamed on video sharing sites and replayed on cable news. Commentaries and op-eds dissected every aspect of her testimony, praising the raw vulnerability that had transformed a television segment into a powerful indictment of systemic injustice. Across digital communities, viewers who once celebrated clever banter now engaged in earnest discussions about economic disparity, political corruption, and the importance of lived experience. Caroline's story had struck a chord with millions, its echoes reverberating in forums from local town halls to the halls of Congress. In the bustling chatter of online comment sections, a diverse chorus emerged. Mothers, fathers, students, and activists shared their own stories of marginalization and the indignities inflicted by unaccountable systems. In these virtual spaces, Caroline's disclosure represented more than a personal history. It became a banner under which people united to demand reform. There was talk of restructuring political debates to honor honesty over trivial wit, and of transforming media interviews into platforms for substantive dialogue. What had once been the stage for snide sarcasm was now recognized as a crucible in which integrity and resilience prevailed. Political pundits, initially known for their acerbic style, found their usual narratives appended by Caroline's fearless candor. Channels that had once echoed with laugh tracks at Stewart's cutting remarks now replayed the segment as a case study in the transformative power of transparency. Panels debated the balance between humor and hard-hitting truths, and the conversation turned from petty political point-scoring to a sober evaluation of how power really works. It was not long before major newspapers featured front-page articles and editorial cartoons that lauded Caroline's courage, emphasizing that true leadership is defined less by one's tenure and more by one's willingness to speak out in the face of systemic injustice. Even Jon Stewart himself, whose career had been built on incisive commentary and witty repartee, found his perspective subtly altered. In follow-up interviews and public statements, he acknowledged Caroline's impact. "Tonight, I witnessed something remarkable," he admitted on a later broadcast, his tone unusually reflective. Caroline Levitt reminded us all that sometimes the most effective response isn't to trade barbs, but to reveal a truth that shakes the foundation of power. "It's a lesson I won't soon forget." His words resonated not as a defeat, but as an evolution, a recognition that even the sharpest satire could be humbled by genuine human experience. As the ripple of reactions intensified, Caroline emerged from the media maelstrom as a new kind of public figure. No longer simply a rising political voice, she had transcended the confines of partisan debate and entered the realm of inspirational leadership. Invitations from universities, civic organizations, and reformative think tanks began to pour in. At public rallies and community gatherings, Caroline was greeted with fervent applause. People from all walks of life saw in her a personification of hope and a rallying point for change, a symbol that the strength of one honest voice could indeed challenge entrenched systems. In one particularly memorable scene, a group of young activists gathered outside a local government building, holding hand-drawn placards that read, "Truth is our weapon," and "Integrity over intimidation." They chanted Caroline's name, their voices ringing out in unison, as if to herald the dawn of a new era in political discourse. At a town hall meeting that same week, a prominent community leader credited Caroline's disclosure of deep-seated corruption and the abuses of power as the spark that ignited a renewed faith in democratic accountability. When someone dares to speak truth to power, it doesn't just change one conversation. It transforms the entire landscape, he proclaimed. Within the media industry itself, the ripple effects of Caroline's segment began to reshape the very protocols of television interviews. Producers and directors took note of the palpable audience reaction, discussing how interviews could be structured to allow more genuine, less contrived exchanges between hosts and their guests. A growing chorus of voices, from established journalists to emerging digital content creators, called for media reform, for interviews that prioritized substance over spectacle, and for platforms that amplified marginalized voices rather than reducing them to entertainment fodder. Caroline's personal journey, once encapsulated in that fateful interview, evolved into a broader movement for systemic change. She continued to speak at conferences and on panels, always returning to that pivotal moment as the catalyst that redefined her destiny. In her subsequent speeches, she recounted not just her tale of struggle but also the overwhelming public response that proved the latent power of vulnerability. "I stand here not as an exception," she told an assembly of civic leaders and young students, "but as proof that our stories, every story of hardship and resilience, can be the seeds of transformation. The evidence is undeniable. When we honor the truth, we unlock the power to change the system itself." Even as the debates and discussions intensified, the cultural dialogue began to shift. Conversations at neighborhood coffee shops, in academic symposiums, and around dinner tables began to center on the need for empathy in leadership and the responsibility of the media to challenge entrenched narratives. Caroline's revelation, once merely one segment on a television show, had become a catalyst for a sweeping re-examination of how society valued truth, accountability, and respect. It forced a reckoning that those who govern and those who report on public affairs must be held to standards that honor the dignity of every individual, especially those who have historically been silenced. In the final moments of the day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, social media feeds continued to buzz with the overwhelming sentiment that change was not just possible, but imminent. The legacy of that transformative interview was already being cemented in the annals of political discourse. A reminder that even in an age of cynicism and spectacle, the human spirit has the capacity to inspire and mobilize towards a more just future. If you were surprised by what Caroline did, believe it is only the beginning. Subscribe so you won't miss the next story that will turn your perception of the power of words.